The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets of London as Captain Marcus Wellington adjusted his ceremonial sword. The year was 1923, and the Royal Guard had been tasked with escorting a valuable shipment of crown jewels from the Tower of London to Buckingham Palace for a special exhibition. What seemed like a routine transfer would soon become one of the most talked-about incidents in the city's criminal history. The notorious Blackwood gang had been watching the Royal Guard's movements for weeks, led by the cunning Thomas Blackwood. This group of 12 hardened criminals had built their reputation on daring robberies across London's wealthy districts. They had successfully stolen from banks, aristocrats, and even government officials, without facing serious consequences. Their confidence had grown so much that they believed no force in England could stop them. Thomas Blackwood stood in his hideout, the abandoned warehouse near the Thames, studying detailed maps of the planned route. His lieutenant, Scarface Murphy, cleaned his pistol while listening to the plan. The gang had inside information from a corrupt palace servant who had revealed the exact time and path the Royal Guard would take. The servant had been promised a hefty sum for this valuable intelligence. The plan seemed foolproof. The Royal Guard typically traveled with only 6 men during these transfers, and they followed predictable routes through quieter streets to avoid drawing public attention. The Blackwood gang had chosen a narrow alley called Sovereign's Lane as their ambush point. High walls on both sides would trap the guards, while multiple exit routes would allow the criminals to escape quickly with their prize. Captain Wellington, however, was no ordinary officer. He had served in the Great War and had survived countless, dangerous situations through careful planning and sharp instincts. As he prepared his men for the journey, something felt different about this particular assignment. The palace had received anonymous tips about potential threats, and Wellington had noticed strangers asking questions about Royal Guard schedules at local taverns. The jewels they were transporting were worth more than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. The collection included ancient diamonds, emeralds that had belonged to medieval queens, and golden artifacts that represented centuries of British royal history. The weight of responsibility sat heavily on Wellington's shoulders as he knew these treasures were irreplaceable symbols of the nation's heritage. Unknown to the Blackwood gang, their corrupt informant had been discovered by palace security just 2 days earlier. The servant had been caught passing messages and was now being held in the tower's dungeon. The Royal Guard had learned of the planned ambush and had spent the previous night preparing a counter-strategy that would turn the tables on the would-be thieves. Wellington gathered his men in the armory, their polished boots echoing against the stone walls. Each guard was a veteran soldier, carefully selected for their loyalty, skill, and unwavering dedication to protecting the crown. They had trained together for years and could communicate with just a glance during dangerous situations. Today, they would need every bit of that experience. The captain explained the situation to his team without revealing all the details of their counterplan. He wanted his men to appear natural and unsuspecting as they walked into what the criminals believed would be an easy trap. The guards checked their weapons, adjusted their red uniforms, and prepared to face whatever dangers awaited them in the narrow streets of London. As the clock struck 9 in the morning, the heavy doors of the Tower of London creaked open. The Royal Guards emerged, carrying a reinforced chest that appeared to contain the precious jewels. Their formation looked standard, with 2 guards in front, 2 in back, and 2 on the sides surrounding the valuable cargo. To any observer, including the Blackwood gang's spotters, this seemed like a routine transport with no unusual precautions. The morning air was crisp, and the sound of their synchronized footsteps echoed through the ancient courtyard. Captain Wellington led his men toward what would become one of the most memorable confrontations between law and lawlessness in London's long history. Neither side could have predicted how dramatically this encounter would change their lives forever. Thomas Blackwood crouched behind a stack of wooden crates in Sovereign's Lane, his heart pounding with anticipation. He had positioned his men strategically throughout the narrow alley, with some hiding on rooftops, and others concealed behind doorways and abandoned carts. Each criminal carried loaded pistols and knives, ready to overwhelm the Royal Guards through sheer numbers and surprise. The gang leader checked his pocket watch nervously. According to their information, the guards should arrive within the next 10 minutes. Blackwood had planned every detail meticulously, from the escape routes through connecting alleys to the safe house where they would divide their stolen treasure. He imagined the shock on the guards' faces when they realized they had walked into a deadly trap. Scarface. Murphy positioned himself on a second-story balcony, his rifle aimed at the entrance to the alley. 3 more gang members hid behind overturned merchant stalls, while 2 others waited in shadowy doorways. The remaining criminals had taken positions at the alley's exit, ready to cut off any retreat. Blackwood smiled grimly, convinced that his superior numbers and element of surprise would guarantee victory against the unsuspecting royal guards. Meanwhile, Captain Wellington and his men approached the planned route, but they were not walking blindly into danger. The previous night, additional soldiers had secretly taken positions throughout the surrounding area. 20 experienced marksmen were hidden on nearby rooftops, their rifles trained on the alley where the ambush was planned. Another dozen guards had disguised themselves as street vendors, workers, and pedestrians, blending seamlessly into the morning crowd. The captain had also arranged for a decoy chest filled with worthless stones and metal, while the real crown, jewels, remained safely locked away in the Tower of London. This elaborate deception would allow them to catch the criminals red-handed while protecting the nation's treasures. Wellington knew that capturing the entire Blackwood gang would send a powerful message to other criminal organizations operating in London. As the royal guards turned onto the street leading to Sovereign's Lane, Blackwood signaled his men to prepare for action. The gang members gripped their weapons tighter, their palms sweating with nervous excitement. They had robbed wealthy merchants and corrupt officials before, but attacking the royal guard represented their boldest and most dangerous operation yet. The sound of marching boots grew louder as Wellington's visible team approached the alley entrance. The captain maintained his composed expression while scanning the area for signs of the hidden criminals. His years of military experience had taught him to notice small details that others might miss. A glint of metal from a rooftop, an unusual shadow in a doorway, or the nervous movement of someone trying too hard to appear casual. Blackwood raised his hand, ready to give the signal for attack. His men tensed, fingers on triggers, waiting for their leader's command. The gang leader's eyes gleamed with greed as he imagined holding the famous crown jewels in his hands. He had heard stories about their incredible value and the prestige that would come from pulling off such an audacious theft. The royal guards reached the mouth of Sovereign's Lane and began to enter the narrow passage. To the watching criminals, everything appeared to be going exactly according to plan. The guards looked alert, but not suspicious, their formation tight around the chest containing what they believed to be priceless royal treasures. Blackwood's heart raced as he prepared to spring his carefully laid trap. Wellington stepped into the alley first, his hand resting casually on his sword hilt. His trained eyes quickly identified several of the hidden criminals, confirming the intelligence his superiors had provided. The captain gave an almost imperceptible nod to one of his men, a signal that meant their counter-ambush was ready to begin. Unknown to the Blackwood gang, they were now completely surrounded by superior forces. The hunters had become the hunted, but they remained blissfully unaware of their desperate situation. As the royal guards moved deeper into the narrow alley, the tension reached its breaking point. Both sides prepared for a confrontation that would be remembered for generations, though only one group truly understood what was about to unfold. The moment of truth had arrived. Blackwood took a deep breath and prepared to signal the attack that he believed would make his gang the most infamous criminals in London's history. Instead, he was about to learn a harsh lesson about underestimating the intelligence, preparation, and overwhelming force of the Crown's most elite protectors. The tension in Sovereign's Lane reached its peak as Thomas Blackwood dropped his raised hand, signaling his gang to attack. "Now!" he shouted, leaping from behind the wooden crates with his pistol drawn. The narrow alley erupted into chaos as 12 criminals emerged from their hiding places simultaneously, weapons blazing and voices roaring with what they thought would be their moment of triumph. Scarface. Murphy fired his rifle from the balcony, aiming at Captain Wellington's chest. 3 gang members rushed forward from behind the merchant stalls, their knives glinting in the morning sunlight. The criminals at the alley's exit moved to block any escape route, while others charged from doorways and shadowy corners. For a brief moment, it seemed like the Blackwood gang's plan was working perfectly, but Captain Wellington was ready. Instead of showing fear or surprise, he smiled coldly and raised his sword high above his head. This was the signal his hidden reinforcements had been waiting for. The captain's voice boomed through the alley with a command that would haunt the criminals' nightmares for years to come. "Spring the trap." The response was immediate and overwhelming. 20 royal guards appeared on rooftops around the alley, their rifles trained on the shocked criminals below. The disguised soldiers threw off their merchant clothes and street vendor costumes, revealing their military uniforms and weapons. In seconds, the Blackwood gang found themselves surrounded by more than 30 armed guards, all pointing deadly weapons in their direction. Scarface Murphy's rifle shot went wide as a sniper's bullet shattered the balcony railing next to his head. He dove for cover, realizing too late that his elevated position had made him an easy target for the hidden marksman. The 3 criminals charging with knives stopped dead in their tracks when they saw rifle barrels emerging from every window and doorway around them. Thomas Blackwood's confident expression melted into pure terror as he understood the magnitude of his mistake. The royal guards had not only known about his ambush but had turned it into a counter-ambush that trapped his entire gang. His dreams of stealing the crown jewels crumbled as he faced the reality of being completely outmaneuvered by forces far more intelligent and better prepared than he had imagined. Captain Wellington stepped forward calmly, his sword still raised, addressing the stunned criminals with authority that made his words echo off the alley walls. "Gentlemen of the Blackwood gang, you are completely surrounded by His Majesty's finest soldiers. Drop your weapons immediately, or face the consequences of your treasonous actions against the crown." The gang members looked around desperately, searching for any possible escape route. Every exit was blocked by armed guards, every hiding place covered by multiple rifles, and every rooftop occupied by expert marksmen. They had walked into what they thought was a simple ambush, only to discover they were trapped like rats in a carefully constructed maze with no way out. Several criminals began dropping their weapons, their hands shaking with fear as they realized their situation was hopeless. The sound of pistols and knives clattering on the cobblestones echoed through the narrow space. But Blackwood refused to surrender, his pride and desperation driving him to make one final, foolish attempt at escape. "This isn't over," Blackwood screamed, firing his pistol wildly while trying to run toward what he thought was an unguarded corner. His shot missed every target, the bullet ricocheting harmlessly off a stone wall. Before he could take 3 steps, 4 royal guards tackled him to the ground, their superior training and coordination making his resistance look pathetic and childish. Scarface Murphy tried to jump from the balcony to another rooftop but found himself face to face with 2 more guards who had been waiting for exactly this move. His attempted escape lasted less than 5 seconds before he was subdued and his weapons confiscated. The other gang members surrendered quickly, understanding that any resistance would only make their punishment more severe. Within minutes, the entire Blackwood gang was on their knees with their hands bound behind their backs. The criminals who had entered the alley with dreams of wealth and infamy now faced the grim reality of spending their remaining years in prison. Their reputation as unstoppable thieves had been destroyed in spectacular fashion, replaced by the humiliation of being completely outplayed by their intended victims. Captain Wellington walked among the captured criminals, his boots clicking against the cobblestones with measured authority. The chest they had attempted to steal sat safely in the center of the alley, still guarded by his men. The gang members stared at it with bitter regret, knowing they had risked everything for treasure that was never truly within their reach. As the dust settled in Sovereign's Lane, Captain Wellington approached the bound criminals with a mixture of satisfaction and disappointment. The Royal Guards had executed their counter-ambush flawlessly, but the captain felt no joy in seeing fellow Englishmen reduced to desperate criminals. He knelt down beside Thomas Blackwood, who was still struggling against his restraints despite the hopelessness of his situation. "Did you really believe that His Majesty's forces would be so easily defeated?" Wellington asked quietly, his voice carrying the weight of authority and experience. Blackwood glared up at him with hatred and embarrassment, unable to find words for his humiliation. The gang leader had built his reputation on careful planning and superior intelligence, only to discover that he had been outmatched at every level. The other gang members sat in stunned silence, their minds struggling to process how quickly their fortunes had changed. Just minutes earlier, they had felt like predators stalking unsuspecting prey. Now they were captured criminals facing charges of treason, armed robbery, and conspiracy against the crown. The severity of their crimes meant they would likely spend decades in prison if they escaped execution entirely. Scarface Murphy nursed a wounded shoulder where he had landed hard during his failed escape attempt. He looked around at his fellow criminals and realized that their days of freedom were over forever. The gang that had terrorized London's wealthy districts for months had been brought down in a single morning by the superior strategy and overwhelming force of the Royal Guard. Captain Wellington opened the chest that the criminals had tried so desperately to steal. Inside, instead of priceless crown jewels, lay carefully arranged stones, pieces of colored glass, and worthless metal trinkets that sparkled convincingly in the morning light. The elaborate deception drew gasps of disbelief from the captured gang members who finally understood the full extent of their defeat. The real crown jewels never left the Tower of London, Wellington explained, his words hitting the criminals like physical blows. Your informant was discovered days ago, and every piece of intelligence you received was carefully crafted to lead you into this trap. You gambled your freedom on information that was completely false. Thomas Blackwood's face turned pale as he absorbed this revelation. His entire plan had been built on lies fed to him by palace security. The corrupt servant he had trusted was, now probably facing his own execution for treason, while the gang had walked blindly into a trap that had been prepared specifically for them. The criminals had been manipulated like puppets by forces far more intelligent than they had imagined. The sound of horse hooves echoed from both ends of the alley as additional royal guards arrived with prison wagons. The reinforcements had been stationed nearby, ready to transport the captured criminals to the Tower of London for interrogation and trial. The heavy wooden wagons, reinforced with iron bars and locks, would serve as mobile prisons until the gang members could be properly secured. As the guards began loading the prisoners, curious crowds gathered at both ends of Sovereign's Lane. Word of the dramatic capture was already spreading through London streets, carried by witnesses who had seen the massive deployment of royal guards. The story of how the notorious Blackwood gang had been outwitted and captured would be told in taverns and drawing rooms across the city for years to come. Captain Wellington supervised the loading process with military precision, ensuring that each criminal was properly secured and documented. The gang members would face individual trials based on their specific crimes and roles in the organization. As the leader, Thomas Blackwood would likely face the harshest punishment, possibly execution for his acts of treason against the crown. Before closing the first prison wagon, Wellington addressed the captured criminals one final time. His words carried the authority of the crown and the satisfaction of justice served. Your reign of terror in London is finished. The people of this city can sleep peacefully knowing that you will never again threaten their safety or property. The gang members sat in their mobile prisons, their dreams of wealth and infamy replaced by the cold reality of iron bars and uncertain futures. They had underestimated not only the intelligence and preparation of the Royal Guard, but also the loyalty and dedication of those who served the crown. Their attempted ambush had backfired spectacularly, turning them from hunters into prey in a matter of minutes. As the prison wagons rolled away from Sovereign's Lane, the street began to return to its normal, quiet atmosphere. The Royal Guards efficiently cleaned up evidence of the confrontation, leaving little sign of the dramatic events that had just unfolded. The narrow alley that had been chosen as an ambush site had instead become the stage for one of London's most successful law enforcement operations. The Tower of London's ancient stones had witnessed countless prisoners enter its gates, but the arrival of the Blackwood gang created an unusual stir among the guards and officials. The prison wagons rolled through the fortress entrance as crowds gathered to catch a glimpse of the criminals who had dared to challenge the Royal Guard. News of their spectacular defeat had spread through London faster than wildfire, making them both infamous and objects of public curiosity. Thomas Blackwood was separated from his gang members and placed in a solitary cell deep within the tower's dungeons. The stone walls were thick and cold, with only a small barred window, high above that, allowed a thin beam of sunlight to enter during midday. The gang leader sat on a wooden bench, staring at the iron bars that now defined the boundaries of his world, wondering how his carefully planned operation had gone so catastrophically wrong. In the interrogation chamber, Captain Wellington sat, across from Scarface Murphy, whose wounded shoulder had been treated by the tower's physician. The captain's questions were methodical and thorough, designed to uncover the full extent of the gang's criminal network and identify any other threats to London's security. Murphy, facing the possibility of execution, began providing information about other criminal organizations and their operations. The trials began 3 weeks after the capture, drawing massive crowds to the courthouse steps. People from all social classes gathered to witness the proceedings, from wealthy aristocrats in fine carriages to common workers who took time away from their jobs. The Blackwood gang's attempted robbery of the crown jewels had captured the public imagination, turning the courtroom into a theater where justice would be dramatically displayed. Judge Harrison, a stern man known for his harsh sentences, presided over the proceedings with unwavering authority. As each gang member was brought before the bench, the evidence against them was overwhelming. Witnesses testified about their previous crimes, while the Royal Guards provided detailed accounts of the failed ambush. The criminals' own weapons and equipment were presented as evidence of their treasonous intentions. Thomas Blackwood's trial lasted 2 full days, with prosecutors painting him as a dangerous enemy of the crown who had threatened the very symbols of British heritage. The prosecution emphasized that attacking the Royal Guard was not merely robbery, but an act of treason against the monarchy itself. Blackwood's defense attorney struggled to find mitigating circumstances, but the evidence was too strong and the crimes too serious. When Judge Harrison delivered the verdicts, his voice echoed through the packed courtroom with finality that silenced even the loudest whispers. Thomas Blackwood was sentenced to death by hanging, while Scarface Murphy and 3 other gang members received life imprisonment at hard labor. The remaining criminals were sentenced to terms ranging from 15 to 25 years, effectively ensuring they would spend their remaining productive years behind bars. The sentences sent shockwaves through London's criminal underworld, where the Blackwood gang had been regarded as untouchable. Other criminal organizations realized that their activities were being watched more closely than they had imagined, and that the Royal Guard's intelligence network was far more sophisticated than anyone had suspected. Several smaller gangs disbanded immediately, while others fled London to avoid similar fates. Captain Wellington attended Blackwood's execution, which took place at dawn 3 days after the sentencing. As the gang leader stood on the scaffold, he looked out at the crowd that had gathered to witness his final moments. His last words were an expression of regret for underestimating the crown's power and a warning to other criminals about the futility of challenging royal authority. The remaining gang members were transported to Dartmoor Prison, a harsh facility on the remote moors of Devon, where they would spend their sentences breaking rocks and building roads under the watchful eyes of armed guards. The hard labor was designed not only as punishment, but as a deterrent to others who might consider following their criminal path. News of the trials and sentences spread beyond London's borders, reaching other cities and towns throughout England. The story became a cautionary tale told in schools and churches, illustrating the inevitable consequences of choosing crime over honest labor. Parents used the Blackwood gang's fate to teach their children about the importance of respecting law and authority. Captain Wellington was promoted to colonel and received a commendation from the king himself for his outstanding leadership during the operation. The successful counter-ambush became a case study at military academies, where future officers learned about the importance of intelligence gathering, strategic planning, and coordinated operations. The colonel's tactics were analyzed and adapted for use in other security situations. The corrupt palace servant who had provided false information to the gang was quietly executed for treason, his name erased from all official records. His fate served as a warning to other palace employees about the serious consequences of betraying the crown's trust. The security breach led to new protocols and background checks that would prevent similar incidents in the future. 5 years after the failed ambush in Sovereign's Lane, London had transformed into a safer city where criminals thought twice before attempting major operations against government targets. The Blackwood Gang's spectacular defeat had created a lasting deterrent effect that extended far beyond the original participants. Colonel Wellington, now recognized as one of England's finest security experts, often walked through the same narrow alley where the historic confrontation had taken place. The alley itself had become an unofficial landmark, with local guides pointing out the exact spots where the criminals had hidden and where the Royal Guards had emerged from their concealed positions. Tourists from across Europe visited London partly to see the location where one of history's most famous criminal ambushes had been turned into a triumph for law and order. The story had grown in the telling, becoming a legend that inspired similar operations in other countries. At Dartmoor Prison, the surviving members of the Blackwood Gang had become cautionary examples for new inmates. Scarface Murphy, now missing 3 fingers from a prison quarry accident, spent his days warning younger criminals about the futility of challenging organized authority. His stories about the failed ambush served as grim entertainment during the long, cold evenings when prisoners gathered around small fires in their cells. The crown jewels that the gang had attempted to steal were eventually displayed in the promised exhibition at Buckingham Palace, where they drew record crowds. Visitors marveled not only at the precious stones and ancient artifacts, but also at the story of their protection. Special plaques described the Blackwood Gang's failed robbery attempt, turning the criminals' defeat into an educational display about the importance of royal security. Colonel Wellington had written a detailed report about the operation that became required reading at military academies throughout the British Empire. His tactics of using false information, coordinated positioning, and overwhelming force were studied and adapted by security forces from India to Canada. The successful counter-ambush had elevated the reputation of British military intelligence to new heights internationally. The families of the imprisoned gang members faced their own struggles with shame and poverty. Thomas Blackwood's widow had been forced to sell their home and move to a poor district where no one knew her husband's criminal history. The children of gang members grew up under the shadow of their father's crimes, some choosing honest paths while others seemed destined to repeat the cycle of criminal behavior. London's police force had learned valuable lessons from the Royal Guard's success, implementing new intelligence-gathering techniques and coordination protocols. The city's crime rate dropped significantly as criminals realized that law enforcement had become more sophisticated and better organized. Street robberies and burglaries decreased as would-be criminals feared facing the same fate as the Blackwood Gang. Sovereign's Lane was eventually renamed Wellington Way in honor of the colonel's tactical brilliance, though locals continued using the old name out of habit. The narrow passage had been widened and improved, with better lighting and regular patrols that ensured it would never again serve as an ambush site for criminals. The transformation symbolized London's commitment to making all its streets safe for honest citizens. New recruits to the Royal Guard learned about the Blackwood Gang operation during their first week of training, studying maps of the ambush site and practicing the coordination techniques that had made the counterattack so successful. The story became part of the organization's culture, reminding guards that intelligence and preparation were more valuable than individual courage when facing organized criminal threats. The operation's success had international implications as well, with foreign governments requesting detailed briefings about British security methods. Colonel Wellington traveled to France, Germany, and Austria to share his expertise with Allied forces, helping to improve security around royal families and government institutions across Europe. The Blackwood Gang's defeat had inadvertently contributed to international security cooperation. As the 10th anniversary of the failed ambush approached, historians began documenting the complete story for future generations. The event had marked a turning point in criminal justice, demonstrating that even the most carefully planned operations could be defeated through superior intelligence and coordinated response. The Blackwood Gang's legacy was not the wealth and infamy they had sought, but rather a permanent reminder of the consequences of challenging established authority. Colonel Wellington, now approaching retirement, often reflected on that morning in Sovereign's Lane as the defining moment of his career. The operation had saved the crown jewels, eliminated a dangerous criminal organization, and established new standards for security operations. Most importantly, it had proven that the crown's protectors could adapt and overcome any threat, no matter how cleverly planned or boldly executed. The story of the Blackwood Gang's failed ambush became a permanent part of London's history, told in books, newspapers, and eventually films that celebrated the triumph of justice over criminal ambition. Future generations would learn from this dramatic confrontation, understanding that crime truly does not pay when faced with the organized force of legitimate authority and the unwavering dedication of those sworn to protect the crown.